Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here with you today. And I have had a host of events on my calendar. And as they come up, it's been great to have a unique experience every time. One of the things that makes it unique today is that I got to meet Miss Joan Saltzman, who's 98 years old today. And I was reared to honor the people who go before me, and I made sure that I gave her a big hug and rubbed as much of her skin, whatever is keeping her spry and alert and committed. I wanted all of that to rub off on me, and she reminds me of an observation I made in January when I saw people marching in the Women's March in Hawaii. I happened to be in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and saw my friends in Hawaii sent me a link of a woman who looked like she was about as young as Joan marching, and it dawned on me that there's no such thing as retiring from justice work. And so that she's here today. That she's here today reminds us that how long we have to be committed to doing what's in the best interest of women and everyone who needs relief from the politics like we have today. I also want to again honor my colleagues who are providers, physician and non, that those are the people in the room who know directly what I feel when it comes to having the privilege of taking care of people who need the services that we provide. So I'm glad for you that you have a cadre of people who are working with this affiliate to provide that care. I also want to acknowledge some of the people who are in arena, the politicians in the room. To be clear, that that's a dirty game and it's a violent game. And for people who self-nominate to stand in the arena to try and bring about the changes that we need. I met someone today and I told him that right now the face of New York is probably for many Representative Peter King as he is seeking to score points politically about the tragedy that happened yesterday. But there are a lot of counter narratives to that kind of politics, people who are committed to fairness and justice and compassion. So I want to thank you for being in the arena to fight for us. And I'm also grateful to be able to acknowledge the clergy leadership in the room because as a person of faith and recognizing that most of the mischief that's being done right now around trying to overturn reproductive rights is related to us allowing people's voices to be in the ascendancy around religious identity and faith. And I met a couple of the rabbis and a Christian minister, all of whom are committed to Planned Parenthood. And in particular, meeting the rabbis, I was reminded of the tremendous work of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel in the civil rights movement, who was a big supporter of Dr. King and a great relationship between the two. If you don't know who Rabbi Heschel was, he's the person with the white beard and the yarmulke marching in Selma. And when they asked him what it felt like to participate in the civil rights movement as a Polish Jew living in New York who was remote from the real terror that the people in the South were feeling, he said, as I marched, it felt like my legs were praying. But one of the things that impressed me most about Rabbi Heschel was there's another event where he exerted national influence around the issue of race in this country. In June of 1963, President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, convened a meeting of clergy, and he called them together to address what he called the Negro problem. And Rabbi Heschel, his daughter, who's a scholar, Susanna Heschel, she saved a telegram that he sent to President Kennedy. And in that telegram he says, President Kennedy, thank you for convening this very important meeting. Thank you for calling on clergy to do more on behalf of the Negro problem. He says that we have to do more. He says that as long as in this country we allow for the humiliation of the Negro, God cannot hear our prayers. And so I would say by analogy, when we think about the ability of our country to have leadership that that terrorizes women and that takes away the essential health care and rights that they need. Given that we self-identify as a Christian nation and a country under God, I would submit to you that as long as we tolerate the humiliation of women and deny them their right to the health care, that God cannot hear our prayers. So let me say again, I'm delighted to be here with you today, joining you as supporters of Planned Parenthood. And as you've heard from the leadership, last November, I too was not so delighted with the outcome of that election. When I woke up on November the 9th, the Christian part of my brain lamented like Job when his travails came upon him. That which I feared greatly has come upon me. But the Amy Winehouse part of my brain remembered a very famous song where the opening line that she made stated, "What kind of fuckery is this?" And now that we're almost a year into this administration, I have the answer. It is total fuckery. Now, I know that language is a little out of bounds and in deference to the clergy leadership here. I was reared in the South. As a Christian boy, I know good, polite Christian language. But let me submit a challenge to you. If you're more offended by the language that I just used than you are about the policies that are coming out of this White House, you need to recalibrate your sensibilities. Because there's a difference between impolite language and profanity and obscenity. Profanity is when you have an administration that will take away basic reproductive health rights from women, even in the face of the danger and the peril that goes with abortion being illegal. That takes away basic health care services that millions have been able to access by trying to overturn the Affordable Care Act. By criminalizing people based on their land of birth or their language or their religious orientation simply because they happen to be non-Christian and non-white or not have been born in this country. That's obscene. And so it's right to be angry, but make sure you're angry about the right things. Bad policies that jeopardize the lives of people. So unless you've been on a rock somewhere, anybody who's associated with Planned Parenthood knows that it's kind of been hell being affiliated with this organization. But I'm reminded of what Sir Winston Churchill said when he was, with regard to what one should do when you're going through hell. And I think the Planned Parenthood staff has taken it to heart. So Winston Churchill said, when you're going through hell, keep going. Right? And well, that's exactly what the Planned Parenthood affiliates around this country have done. They've kept going. Through attacks by conservative political forces, you've kept going. You kept going in the aftermath of a hostile assault on a Planned Parenthood affiliate in Colorado that left 3 people murdered. You've kept going. In the face of a national scandal fabricating the sale of fetal tissue to impugn the integrity of Planned Parenthood, you've kept going. And because you've kept going, as you've heard, women, men, teens, LGBTQ and trans people have all been better off because you've provided care no matter what. You provided clinical care, education, advocacy to diverse people and in diverse settings and under all kinds of circumstances. You provided, as you heard, prenatal care, cervical screenings, abortion, trans care. You've done it all no matter what and no matter for whom. Because you've done that, the people in this area are grateful. You should be proud. And I personally am proud to stand here as a friend of Planned Parenthood of Nassau County. Going to Mississippi, if I don't, who will? That was the question, that was the title of an essay that I wrote for the National Partnership for Women and Families about a few years ago. But it was also the question that I asked myself when I was invited to visit Mississippi's only abortion clinic at Jackson Women's Health Organization. That happened for the first time in August of 2011. JHU, as it's also known, or the Pink House, because it's the only bubblegum / Pepto-Bismol pink abortion clinic in the state. My visit there occurred 3 months before that state defeated a personhood amendment and 5 months before that the governor took office to declare that he was intent on making Mississippi an abortion-free state. He's now in his second term. But after I became an abortion provider full-time on the day that Dr. George Tiller was assassinated in 2009, and subsequently served 2 years as the medical director for Planned Parenthood in DC, I made a decision that I would be willing to travel. And so I was contacted by an activist who sought to match clinics, which had a limited number of providers, but had open facilities with physicians and providers who might be willing to travel. And so when I was identified and was asked to go to Mississippi to provide care, my first response was no, and my second response was hell no. I'd seen Mississippi burning one too many times, and I grew up in the South, and I remember thinking as I drove through the northeast corner of Mississippi on my way to medical school at Iowa, that somehow for me it seemed, as I drove at night, as many times African Americans would do during segregation days because they didn't want to have incidental contact with racist whites. I remember thinking that the nights were too dark and the trees were too tall. But I decided that if I was going to say no, then at least I should go and see what I was saying no to. And so when I visited that clinic and met the staff, many of whom were veterans of the civil rights movement, many of whom were women of color who had now pivoted their efforts towards providing reproductive care for women in that state. In my gut, I knew this was the place where I wanted to go and make my contribution. Now, given the inclinations of some at this moment in our nation's history to give rights to fetuses at the expense of the women who carry them, using the law oftentimes to do so, we said that too much justice is a form of injustice. I agree. Justice for fetuses at the expense of women, in my opinion, is too much justice. As I listen to the ideologues, they claim that they are protecting those who can't protect themselves. I see the faces of the women whose lives are being controlled by these people who are more enamored with hypothetical people than real ones. I find myself listening for the voices of the 35-year-old mother of 5 whose 2-year-old had recently died from a childhood cancer, who found herself 9 weeks pregnant, and she confided in me that she neither had the financial nor the emotional capacity to provide for another child at this time. I see the 15-year-old who's being reared by her grandmother in Mississippi in abject poverty, who had aspirations herself of becoming a pediatrician, whose grandmother had to sell her couch to pay for the abortion that she had. I see the face of a 12-year-old victim of incest that I provided an abortion for at 23 weeks gestation in Chicago, who was brought in by her mother and father, only to find out that her father was her abuser. I often struggle with the ideologue's indifference to how my doing that young lady's abortion enabled me to restore her childhood and hopefully to begin for her the process of restoring her ability to trust adults, not to mention the men in her life, that they might protect her and not violate her. So I wonder today, as I'm standing here and we contemplate what's at stake, do you hear the voices of the women having their lives jeopardized by people who are seeking to control them through policies that reduce them to incubators, and that say that unless they are willing to have a baby, whether they intend to or not, that they are shirking their most primary responsibility? We all know in this room that unless a woman controls her fertility, she doesn't control much else about her life. I wonder if you hear those voices, if you hear women, if you see their faces. I do. Somebody once said that when you wrestle with your conscience and you lose, you actually win. And that's how I like to describe my beginning as an abortion provider. The decision to serve women in this way for me was the culmination of a 12-year struggle beginning during my residency, with me questioning what my role should be in caring for women when they experience unplanned, unwanted pregnancies or wanted but legally flawed ones. Now, for me, that was no major crisis moment. It was just over time, I had a diminishing sense of return as I practiced full-scope OBGYN, as I realized that I was unable to address the most critical healthcare needs for men and women when it came to my awareness that now almost 1 in 4 women in this country by the time they're age 45 will have had an abortion or will have needed abortion services. Now, given that part of my anxiety was related to concern about losing people in my life that I've always held dear, the decision for me to move forward as a provider was also a decision for me to reject what ultimately came to feel to me like cowardice. So I guess I had no choice other than to explore more deeply my values around what it meant to call myself a women's health provider and to also have a Christian identity. And I had to do so to the point where I became uncomfortable not providing abortion for women when I know what they face. I attribute the ultimate turbulence that led me to change my actions to become an abortion provider to a sermon by Dr. Martin Luther King, and that many of you know as the Mountaintop Sermon. It was the sermon that he preached on April 3rd, 1968, the night before he was assassinated. And whereas you might remember he said, "I've been to the mountaintop, I may not get there with you," there was another part of that sermon that spoke very deeply to me. I've heard the sermon many times, listened to it many times, but for this time, as I contemplated what my role would be in a clinic where women were being denied access to abortion in Hawaii after having experienced access to it since 1970, they were one of the first states, along with New York, to legalize abortion. We had an administrator who also had a fundamentalist born-again Christian identity who had decided that it was his prerogative to deny women this service. So I found myself with the same faith identity but with a different conclusion, now challenged around what my role would be in securing access for women. And so on that particular day while listening to that sermon on my cassette tape, yes, it was a cassette tape, that's how long ago it was. In that story, in that sermon, Dr. King uses the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan told by Jesus to his followers to illustrate shared human concern. In that story, Dr. King noted that what made the Good Samaritan good was his ability to reverse the question of concern. And whereas there were others who passed by this injured traveler and refused to stop and help because their primary question was, what will happen to me if I stop to help this person? Dr. King said that what made the Good Samaritan good was his ability to reverse the question of concern. And instead of asking what will happen to me, he asked, what will happen to this man if I don't stop to help? And that question for me reversed my question of concern. And whereas I found myself initially asking, is it right for me as a Christian to perform abortions? I found myself asking, is it right for me as a Christian not to perform abortions when I know what women face in terms of when abortion is illegal and inaccessible, how women are seriously injured and how they die? And so it was the precision of that question that became so sharp when I applied it to my encounter with patients around unplanned, unwanted pregnancy or one to believably flawed ones, that ultimately made me uncomfortable, again, not providing abortion care for the women that saw me and when I knew what they faced. And so it was that, along with my previously stated notion of shrinking away from a life of cowardice, that led me to change my path and to ultimately move home to Alabama, where I saw women like the ones I described earlier. And so now I'm standing here in Nassau County telling you my story. Now, increasingly, we find ourselves, as we look at the current political climate and situation, we find ourselves living in a time that calls for courage, especially as the world changes and becomes more diverse. The current attack that you've heard on women via their reproductive health and privacy is not new, but I'm not so sure that we've ever been this close to the outright loss of access to reproductive rights and reproductive services by overturn of the Roe statute that's been in place now for almost 45 years. I know that even as we sit here, if we were to look at recent events, it's patently obvious in no uncertain terms that there are people who would like to take us back to a time which I have no desire to return. For people who talk about the good old days, or let's make America great again, the good old days weren't always that good for some of us, namely racial and ethnic minorities, women, and people with LGBTQ identities. So while people are waxing nostalgic for the good old days, and I define nostalgia as when people remember things better than they actually were, some of us have no desire to go back there, and for those of us who understand what it means to go back, we have to be unequivocal and say on no uncertain terms that we will not default back to a time where women's lives are jeopardized by lacking access to the basic health care services that they need, including abortion. Since the 2010 midterm election, in which the Republicans seized legislative majorities at the national level and governorships all across the country to match the new power that they found in the House, studies have now shown that state-level conservatives have done what the GOP Congress could not do. They've sharply restricted and all but eliminated access to abortion. Between 2011 and now, we have over 300 abortion restrictions enacted at the state level because there are so many laws that there are now whole swaths of the country where abortion has become practically illegal. People tend to think that abortion access is worse in the South, but I prefer the definition of the South that Minister Malcolm X gave once when he was asked if race relations were better in the North than they were in the South. When he was asked this by a journalist, he said, "Oh no, things are as bad up South as they are down South." And the journalist, perplexed, said, "Well, what do you mean?" And Minister Malcolm said, "Well, when it comes to race relations in this country, I define South as south of the Canadian border." So if you think about the dispersion of negative laws that reduce access to abortion in this country, even though you like to think that New York is better, and it is a model for many states around the country, you'd be hard-pressed to say that a woman in rural upstate New York, if you said her access to abortion, she'd probably say, you're mistaken if you think that I have an easier time getting an abortion than a woman in Jackson, Mississippi. Because these laws, as one of my table guests said, that even though things are better than most here in New York, there's not an absence of tension or an absence of effort to make things worse. And the difference between things being like they are in Jackson, Mississippi and in most of New York is you. It's people like you who understand the importance of this work and support it either financially or with your time, with volunteers, or with your bumper stickers, or in your lunch meetings, and you tell people that abortion care is health care and that 1 in 3 women need this care. The difference between New York and Mississippi is you. So that's all on the legislative front. As you've heard, on the ground, Planned Parenthoods have been under attack. There have been increasing efforts towards sabotage. There have been increasing hostility. Providers and patients alike are being attacked. Clinic violence is up. And as we speak, the assassin of Dr. David Gunn, the first abortion provider killed in this country approximately 24 years ago, his assassin is up for a parole hearing today. As if 24 years in prison for a terroristic act, an open and blatant assassination, is long enough. And I don't know if you've seen, if you follow me on Twitter or Facebook, but I wrote a letter at the request of his son, David Gunn Jr., the organization Lady Parks Justice, headed by Liz Winstead. They've coordinated a letter writing effort. So if you feel it, so given these realities, as I prepare to close, all the things that I say that we're facing with regard to women and their rights and health care in this country for everyone. When faced with these things, the question is, and I'll ask you in my best Southern Alabama grandma vernacular, what is we gonna do? Let me interpret for some of you. What are our options and what are the possibilities for us to assuage this onslaught of reproductive oppression in this country? I just want to make sure y'all understand what I'm asking. Well, one of the things that we have to do is, in addition to practicing our basic civic responsibilities like participating in politics, we have to engage in the cultural battle around reproductive rights. And that battle occurs on many fronts, and it runs parallel to the political battle. It's where we have to be willing to track legislation and to monitor candidates, and we have to become on the issue of reproductive rights and the issues of women, if need be, we have to become single issue voters. We simply cannot have split allegiance. I don't personally, I try to stay nonpartisan, but I'm going to say to you, I don't know what a pro-life Democrat is. If the Democratic Party has as an essential platform that it is the party of women's rights and reproductive rights, I don't know what a pro-life Democrat is. If you can start to equilibrate around what is essential for the health and well-being, I know if I were voting on race issues, if people had an anti-black campaign, or at least were equivalent on it, you couldn't get my votes. I'm simply saying that 51% of the population in this country, which is women, should say that if you can't be firm and clear about where you stand on women's reproductive rights, you can't have my vote. I understand the concept of pragmatism and realism and all of that, but the reality is for women who can't control their reproduction or who can't get their mammograms or their pap smears, they don't control much else about their lives. So I ask you to understand that I'm that narrow when it comes to women's issues. As far as I'm concerned, with women's issues, it is the issue. And towards that end, I was motivated to write a book. I've written a book. This is not a shameless plug to buy Life's Work, A Moral Argument for Choice, but I do think it's a good book. But one of the reasons I think it's a good book is not that I wrote it, but it's because my effort is because of what I tried to do in this book. And I think it's best captured by a cartoon that I recently saw where there's a woman and a man having a dialogue. There's a balloon over the woman's head responding to something that the man has just said. You can infer what he must have said based on her response. Apparently they were having a conversation about reproduction, or at least where people come from. Because the man apparently said to her, "You came from my rib," intimating the creation story of Adam being placed in a deep sleep. His rib was taken and woman was made from man, as to say that man came first and women are secondary and subservient to men. Now, there are some doctors in the room, and if you've taken embryology, you know biologically that's not plausible that men came first, but I digress. So, in response to him saying, "You came from my rib," and asserting his male dominance and authority, the balloon over the woman's head says, the woman says to the man, "I didn't come from your rib, you came from my vagina," right? And if you think about it, that is the tension in our reality today. We have a scientific understanding of reproduction. Babies come from vaginas, and we have a non-scientific or non-empiric understanding of reproduction, and the two are not necessarily enemies, but they have their roles. Down south we say if you stay in your lane, there's no traffic. And so the problem that we have now is we have people insisting on their specific religious or non-empiric understanding and is holding sway in policy. You know, religious understanding about reproduction is too subjective and too plural. In fact, my friend who's Jewish, his mother says that the Jewish definition of viability is when you graduate from college and you have a job, right? So it is to say that the religious understanding of reproduction is not objective enough for us to be making policy on. Policy has to be governed by science and evidence. Dr. King said that those two understandings are not enemies. Science gives mankind knowledge, which is power. Religion gives mankind wisdom, which is control. Science deals mostly with facts. Religion deals with values. The two are not enemies. And so this book that I wrote is about us understanding that there are different ways of being, different levels and different understandings that we have to use to process reality. Non-empiric ways of understanding as well as empiric ways. And the problem that we have now is in the policy arena, we have people leveraging things that are non-scientific understandings. You cannot determine the significance of an unintended pregnancy or of a lethally flawed pregnancy or of a woman who has perilous health issues without doing that in a scientific way. And so I'm calling, as many have called, as Dr. King calls it, we have to be smart enough and good enough. If you are strictly logical and reason, you're cold and sterile and you're going to be indifferent to human need. If you are totally sympathetic and emotional around the human crises that we face, you're going to be sentimental and also not effective. We have to be smart enough and good enough. And so I'm calling on you to wage the battle by, in your synagogues, in your churches, in your clubs, in your places of work, in your friendship conversation, in your dorm room. We have to make it clear that women's health is health care, and that includes abortion. And we have to do that right alongside our ability to monitor politics and to battle for women and their rights. So as I close, I leave you with the words of one of the greatest American heroes, in my opinion, because he helps us to understand how willing we have to be to struggle, because someone once said that good people elect bad politicians when they fail to vote. And we've seen that firsthand in the last election. But I'll leave you with this thought of, given that where we are in this country, this has to be the level of commitment that we have to reproductive rights, and women need us. Frederick Douglass said that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. He said, find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And those will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows or both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. How much more reproductive injustice are we willing to endure in this country? That's the question I ask to you. And I tell you that the answer is to be found when you look in the mirror and you repeat the words of one of the wisest pediatricians I know, Dr. Seuss, where he said in the Lorax, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's gonna get better. It's not. So thank you so much for your attention.